I shall begin by speaking about Nicholas Whyte's grandmother, because she was American. And though he was born and raised in Ireland, and I think considers himself thoroughly and completely Irish, he holds Irish and British citizenship, he nevertheless has those roots in this country. Nicholas went to Cambridge University, where he did a bachelor's degree in natural science, physics, and theoretical science, and then a master's in history and the philosophy of science. And we had a brief discussion today, and he did it on medieval astrology. Is that correct? I wonder if we offer that kind of a major here. Wouldn't that be wonderful? He was active in politics already from his undergraduate days, and continued political activity in North Ireland before jumping then into the world of international affairs, where he worked for the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs for a time, and then on to the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels. It was a leading think tank in the area. Currently, he has been serving since 2002 as the director of the International Crisis Group. The International Crisis Group is a non-governmental organization based in Brussels, with approximately 90 staff members on 4 continents worldwide. It deals with countries coming out of conflicts or crises that have usually severely disrupted, or in some cases nearly destroyed, the countries. He spends part of his time, he told me he splits his time nearly evenly between administering this organization and doing diplomatic work with all the diplomats of the European Union in Brussels. He's extremely well informed on the European Union, as you shall see in a moment. The International Crisis Group, areas where he has been in the Balkans. He is currently very involved in Moldova. I'm sure you all know where that is, and the Caucasus. He'll speak briefly about that. He's also dealing at the moment with some real hot spots in Macedonia and Kosovo and Albania. So you can see that he is wide-ranging in his interests. He did his undergraduate work, as I said, at Cambridge, and his master's work, and did a doctor of philosophy at Queen's University of Belfast. So he has both broad academic background as well as international political experience. Please welcome with me Nicholas Whyte.
Thanks very much, Professor Lyon. I must say it's a real pleasure to be here. I've visited America a few times in search of my grandmother's heritage, in search of my own work, professional requirements. This is the first time I've been in the state of Utah. I hope it will not be the last. I'm very much enjoying it so far. Professor Lyon's quite right. I come to this area of international politics from a backward part of Western Europe, which has retained the integrity of its own local quarrel over hundreds of years. And for me, the whole history of European integration is a triumph of idealism over adversity to a certain extent. It's also a lesson for ancient conflicts in other parts of the world that it's possible to overcome them. But it's actually quite difficult to answer the very basic question of why is the European Union? That may seem like a strange formulation, but if you were to ask why is the United States, it's actually rather easy to work out why this country exists. The Declaration of Independence sets it out very clearly, with a decent respect to the opinions of mankind, a glorious phrase which I wish other people would use, which indeed people could use a bit more often. The Declaration of Independence sets out the reason why this country wanted statehood in the 18th century in a crystal clear manner. The greatest president of this country, 77 years later, put it even more succinctly. He said, "This is a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." you will search in vain for such a succinct and clear statement of why the European Union exists. The Treaty of Rome in 1958, which established the European Economic Community, did have quite a good phrase. It said that it was designed to seek an ever closer union between the people singular, of Europe. But that's process rather than principle. It's geography rather than concrete action. And if you look at the current draft European Constitution, if you look at its preamble, you'll notice that instead of "we the people," as in the American Constitution, it actually begins with His Majesty, the King of the Belgians, the President of the Czech Republic, Her Majesty, the Queen of Denmark, right the way down to the Government of the Kingdom of Sweden, Her Majesty, the Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Drawing inspiration from the cultural, religious and humanist inheritance of Europe, from which have developed the universal values, the inviolable and inalienable rights of the human person, democracy, equality, freedom and the rule of law, and so on, for another 325 pages. This is not very clear or succinct. And so, if we want to find out why the European Union exists, I think we have to change the focus of the question a little bit. And instead ask, what is the European Union? The European Union is formed from 25 states, and in total contrast to the American experience, it's worth saying that 23 of those 25 in the last 100 years have experienced either dictatorship or oppression by their neighbours, or both. The exceptions are England, I exclude Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland from that, and Sweden. And this is a formative historical thing for Western European countries. And it's no wonder that the original 6 members of the European Community in 1958 included the 2 countries that had, or at least felt they had suffered most from 3 wars in 1870, 1914, 1918. That's to say France and Germany. Also the 3 countries between them that had been squashed most heavily by those wars: Belgium, Netherlands and Luxembourg, and the country that had been left constitutionally hanging with a dysfunctional political system after the Second World War, which was desperately looking for a wider international community to merge into, which is Italy. It's interesting also to notice that the British and other neighbours actually were involved in the early negotiations to form the European Community. They backed out because they were worried that the phrase about an ever closer union might actually be serious. Whether it was or not, we can determine. This continued until, the British then changed their minds in the 1960s, but at that point the French wouldn't let them in. Finally, in 1974, the British and their 3 closest economic satellites, that's UK, also Ireland, Denmark, and Norway, all agreed they might join the European Union, except then the Norwegians had a referendum and voted against it. So that created a situation of a bloc of capitalist democracies in northwestern Europe, bordered to the south by the dictatorships of Spain, Portugal and Greece, and to the east by the communist world, this being still in the middle of the Cold War. But it's interesting that almost exactly at the point that the EU had its first expansion, this was also precisely the point that the authoritarian regimes in Portugal and Greece fell, followed shortly after by that in Spain. And so in the early 1980s, these countries as new democracies on the European fringe also joined. Greece actually before Spain and Portugal. And at this point, the European Union became more of an economic project. A crucial figure in this, although she hates to be reminded of it these days, was Margaret Thatcher, who believed that constructing a single European market, which would be a place where people would feel safe to trade with each other, was a project that was worthwhile, was a project that was worth sacrificing certain amounts of British sovereignty to. And so at that point, the EU was on its way to becoming an economic superpower. And at this stage, again, the neighbouring states who had opted out of previous enlargements because they felt that it was too political and not in their economic interests to join, in the early to mid-1990s, they too applied for membership, and all four of them were granted accession treaties. And now we're talking about Austria, Sweden, Finland, and Norway. Except that the Norwegians had another referendum. A friend of mine was actually the Norwegian commissioner appointed to the commission in 1995. He told me that as the results came through, someone actually came into the meeting he was sitting in and took away his nameplate from in front of him. That seems a bit cruel, but he shouldn't be Norwegian is my answer. Not very comforting, I suppose. At the same time as this was happening, of course, communism had fallen across the entire of Eastern Europe, and suddenly you had a whole new geopolitical situation. Countries like Poland and the Czech Republic and Hungary, which felt that they were part of the European mainstream and had been artificially kept away from it for ages. Countries also small but forward-looking countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovenia, which had managed to disentangle themselves from larger federations with a minimum of fuss and which were seen as safe, stable democracies which were in need of support. And so it was that this year the European Union had its largest ever enlargement, with the 8 former communist states. I have to do it from the top because you can never remember doing it alphabetically. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, the Czech Republic, which is the correct English formulation, my Czech friends tell me, Slovakia, Hungary, and Slovenia. And at the same time, the EU moved to fill a small geopolitical gap that had been created in the Mediterranean by also absorbing Malta and most of Cyprus, although not all because of the events of 1974. So now you have a European Union which consists of, I have the latest figures here, they say 456 million people, which in comparison, the United States figure is 292 million. It's an awful lot bigger. It's the biggest single economic space in the world. And the countries range in size from the Germans, 83 million, right the way down to, which is the smallest, yes, it's by a hair, the smallest is Malta with 400,000. Luxembourg has 450,000. I'm sure they're really proud of that. So you now have got a federation of 25 seriously well-developed member states, and there are others queuing up to join. Already in the accession queue, you have Bulgaria and Romania, which have been given a promise that they can join in 2007. Personally, I think the Romanians may not make it. I think they may find themselves lumped in with Croatia, which I think is likely to join in 2009. Also in the list, we now have Turkey, as of last week. Also having submitted a formal membership application, we have Macedonia, the former Yugoslav Republic. And I think in the queue, we will see Albania, Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro, probably separately from Serbia, and ultimately, in some shape or form, Kosovo, once the question of Kosovo's final status with Serbia has been settled. That's fairly clear. That then, if you look at the geopolitical space, you basically have got Western Europe right up to the boundaries of Russia as it was in roughly the year 1920. That is to say, not including the South Caucasus, but going right up to the Polish-Baltic states border. What does the EU do? It is a free trade area. It is a customs union. It is a single economic space where people can exercise the 4 freedoms. The four freedoms, incidentally, are not Roosevelt's four freedoms of freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. They are much more technocratic European four freedoms: free movement of goods, free movement of persons, freedom to provide services, and free movement of capital. I find the contrast between these two uses of the phrase four freedoms very interesting. Freedom of movement, of course, is a little bit constrained in that citizens of the new member states don't get to move directly into the European Union, the old member states, as yet, but they will do after a transition period. The EU also has got the single currency, the euro currency. The Eurozone's population is 308 million because it doesn't include, as yet, most of the eastern states. It doesn't include the British or the Danes or the Swedes. It does produce these rather nice banknotes, which I'm sure you've seen, each of them with an educational map of Europe printed on it, including all the wee bits of France that people forget about overseas, including Martinique and Guyana and so on. I thought I had one, but I seem to have mislaid it. There are things that the European Union doesn't do. The European Union is not the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe is a different organisation based in Strasbourg, which supervises the human rights regime for the wider European area and includes basically all the countries going right as far east as Azerbaijan and Russia. What exactly Azerbaijan is doing there is a question I ask, but have not yet had a good answer for. The Council of Europe does have judicial power in the human rights area. It can actually impose fines and sanctions on countries that are not seen as fulfilling their human rights obligations. The European Union is not a collective security institution. That role is basically played by NATO and will continue to be played by NATO as long as the American policy sees that as in America's self-interest. It's not even fantastically useful at doing multilateral diplomacy. We see that really happening obviously through the United Nations, but also through the OSCE, the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which came out of the Helsinki process. These are each very different in character, and the EU as an actor hasn't really started to interface in a completely smooth way with any of them. I work, as Professor Lyons said, in the foreign policy area in Brussels. I work on the countries closest to the European Union, which are at most danger of collapse or of crisis. And that means specifically Bosnia, Serbia, Macedonia, Kosovo, Moldova, place close to my heart, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia. And my experience of somebody at the coalface, as it were, trying to get the sense out of the EU institutions, I find that I deal with its four different manifestations in quite different ways. And if I were in business or involved with environmental or social legislation, my approach would be completely different. The foreign policy picture of the EU is really a bit weird. And I'll just explain that. If I can clear a bit more space. This still comes under what is the European Union? You'll be aware that the main executive body of the European Union is the European Commission. And this consists of one reasonably senior politician nominated by each of the member states, each of whom is given a particular portfolio. The two that I will be dealing with most are the Finn and the Austrian, who have been given, respectively, the Balkans and the rest of the world to deal with. That's the rest of the world, not including the third world, which went to the Belgian, for some reason. The Commission is important because it's got the most bureaucrats. And also, it's got the most money. That's a euro symbol, in case you haven't seen it. The sort of E with two strokes through it. The Commission, however, has much to its dismay lost a lot of power in foreign policy that it used to have. It used to be that the Commission officials were the ones who were determining exactly what European money was going to be spent in a particular way, and they were the only ones charged with external action within the EU. There's been a demand that, for instance, the heads of Commission offices abroad in different countries should appear for hearings before the European Parliament. So far this has been resisted, but it indicates the extent to which the heads of Commission delegations, which tend to be just administering aid programmes, see themselves as European ambassadors. At the moment, they're not. In fact, I find that in terms of policy work, for me, a more useful institution is the European Council Secretariat. When I first came to Brussels, the European Council Secretariat had only one very boring task, and that was to draw up the agenda for meetings of ministers from each of the member states. In 1999, however, it acquired something much more important. It acquired a single figurehead, who is Javier Solana, the former Spanish foreign minister and the former Secretary General of NATO, who is empowered to speak on behalf of the European Union as a single voice. He rejoices in a very long title, which I'd abbreviate as High Representative. The full title is that he is the High Representative for the Common Foreign Security Policy and also the General Secretary of the Council. But you don't have to write that down. The reason for creating somebody with that position was basically to answer Henry Kissinger's famous question, what is Europe's phone number? Though I must say, as somebody who deals on a policy basis with Washington, I would like to know what Washington's phone number is as well. I find that as I shunt across the city from State Department to National Security Council to Pentagon to Congress, single voice for European policy has actually been very positive. It's meant that instead of the European Union's contribution to foreign policy being ministers meeting together and passing pompous resolutions saying to the warring parties in Yugoslavia, you really should stop fighting, you know. Now there is actually somebody who can go physically in and say to them, you really should stop fighting, you know. And now that may not sound like much of a difference, but I saw it working in 2001 in Macedonia, where very simply there was a burgeoning crisis, and it was to a large extent sorted out by direct diplomatic intervention from Solana and from his very senior aides, with a great deal of heavy lifting also done by the American ambassador in town at the time as well. So it has made a difference having somebody who you can point to and say, that is Europe's phone number, it's 285-7111. Don't write that down. So I've seen that the Council Secretariat gaining in power. Nonetheless, it still has to share power. The European Council is the servant, not the master, of the European member states. So the third group of people that I spend time talking to are those in the permanent representations. Now, of course, in the European Union, there are 25 member states, and all of them are equal. But in the words of George Orwell, some of them are more equal than others. The ones that I spend most of my time on are the three big hitters, that is to say, the British, the French, and the Germans. Basically, anything in the EU that has been agreed by the French and Germans is pretty likely to get through. And if the British have been persuaded to sign on to it, it's almost certain that it will get through. The other 22 countries will very rarely stand up to the big three getting together. It's interesting that one excludes Italy, which has got the same population, in fact a larger population than France from this category. So, it's the same population I see from my list here. The fact is that Italy's very strange political system has left it with a foreign ministry whose officials on the whole are very, very pro-European and anti-American, but a set of politicians who on the whole are very pro-American and rather less pro-European. The result is that Italy is actually unable to construct a coherent policy at a European level. And I've read some things written about the US State Department, but I think you should investigate what's happening in Rome if you really want to see a dysfunctional system at work. In addition to those big countries, often you will find smaller countries have got a particular interest in a particular problem. I mentioned Moldova earlier, and oddly enough, this is one where the two branches of the Italian political system are in agreement. They're quite keen to have a limited system of migration with Moldova and quite keen to try and ameliorate the problems there as best they can. And they're not very successful, but at least they're trying in the same direction. So Moldova is one country that I do talk to the Italians about. The Balkan countries, of course, I talk to the neighbours, the Greeks, the Hungarians, the Slovenes, and to a certain extent the Czechs as well. Also, because the European Union has got this rotating presidency system, I always find it worthwhile to keep in touch with whoever holds the presidency of the day. At the moment it is the Dutch. And also because whoever is chairing the meetings tends to be too busy, I try and keep in touch also with the next presidency, which is Luxembourg, and the one after, which in this case is actually Britain for the second half of next year, who are already on my list. But I find that talking around the permanent representations does give you an idea of which countries are coming from where, what the currents of debate are within the European Council. I had a very interesting lunch last Friday with a Finn, an Estonian and a Belgian, and these are three countries with completely different historical experiences. Particularly interesting to see the divide between the Estonians, who of course were under Russian rule until 1990, and the Finns, who escaped Russian rule in 1917. And the Finns' traditional neutral policy, not too keen on getting stuck in. The Estonians, very keen to get stuck into problems. Of course, they'd be using other people's soldiers because they only have a population of 1.5 million. But they're very keen to try and push the policy agenda forward. And they're also very pro-American, as you would expect of an ex-communist country that couldn't wait to get out of the Soviet Union as quickly as possible. The Belgians, on the other hand, completely the opposite, very much suspicious of these Anglo-Saxon conspiracies, though given that the others at the table were an Irishman and two Finno-Ugrics, it wasn't really very Anglo-Saxon. But the Belgians very much in line with the French view that the world, the European civilization project surely should be one that we don't need outside help in the English language with. Nonetheless, the entire conversation was in English, as indeed are most of my conversations in Brussels, despite the fact that French is one of the main working languages of the European Union. The fourth group of people that I talk to in Brussels as a foreign policy practitioner are members of the European Parliament. Now, the European Parliament has got quite strong legislative powers, particularly in the fields of environmental legislation, in the fields of economic regulation, in the fields of customer services, and basically in constructing the single market that we spoke of in the 1990s. And it's gradually accreted more and more power. It's interesting that the European Parliament is excluded from power in two very important areas. One of them is the area in which most of the EU's budget is spent, which is agriculture. That has been reserved as something that will be carved out between the governments. And the European Parliament barely gets sight of the agriculture budget. The other one, not surprisingly, is foreign policy, which remains something that the European member states cling to very jealously. I still find I can use the European Parliament. I find I use it as a nuclear option. It is a way of getting issues into the public domain. All of my other conversations with ambassadors, with bureaucrats, with council secretariat officials tend to be off the record, trying to chivvy them behind the scenes to move in particular directions. If they're absolutely unwilling to do so, then my option is to get the Parliament to pass a resolution, or at least to hold a debate on the topic that is of interest to me. It's interesting and embarrassing to note that the power of the European Parliament is constrained by geography. The European Parliament meets 1 week every month in Strasbourg. That is where its plenary sessions are. Strasbourg is 4 hours' drive from Brussels. I know by American standards that's not much, but by European standards, starting from Belgium, that's 2 countries away, Luxembourg and France. Okay, Luxembourg's not that big. It seems to me that this is how you emasculate your legislature, by not putting it near the seat of actual power. If you look at Washington, D.C., which was the first but not the last city to be designed as a capital, the very centre of Washington is the Capitol building. That's where the streets are numbered from. That's where your ABCs go up and down. That's your northwest, northeast, southeast, southwest quadrants go from. Whereas the European Parliament seat is in Strasbourg. And its library is in Luxembourg, halfway between Strasbourg and Brussels. This is a very good way of preventing MEPs from doing any serious research on the issues on which they're supposed to legislate. And it's something that I think is crying out for reform. Despite all this, I must say that my experience of talking to policymakers in Brussels is that they're all very intelligent, they're all very committed, and they're all very keen to talk about what it is that they are doing. And it's compared with some national bureaucracies, it's rather heartening that people are prepared to be open about what the internal policy debates are. And I must say I don't even find this so much in Washington, where even between Democrats and Republicans, those who are in office and those who are out of office, there is a certain narrowness of consensus among those who are within the Beltway, as the cliche goes. Perhaps my experiences of Washington have not been broad enough, and of course I must admit I've only done it under the current administration. But I just offer that as an observation. To the final question, has the EU developed muscles from Brussels? As an economic actor, I think it has. As a trading bloc, the EU is the biggest in the world. It packs serious weight inside the World Trade Organization. European Union representations are able to force changes in US domestic policy, for instance in subsidies on steel. And you know, this is a country that prides itself on its independence from all other sources. The euro is the peg for quite a lot of the world, although the dollar, I think, is still a stronger currency in that way. I understand that 70% of all dollars that have been printed are in circulation outside the United States, mostly in Russia and in Latin America. However, the euro is the peg for instance, the Central African countries. It's actually legal currency in both Kosovo and Montenegro, even though neither of them is an independent state. And of course, it's also the legal currency in the microstates of Vatican City and Monaco, San Marino, Andorra. Not that people really care very much about them. So the euro is there, and it's becoming stronger as these things go. But I think it's not yet exceeded the strength of the dollar. On the other hand, if the dollar were to be weakened still further in an act of deliberate policy by the US Treasury, which I guess is a possibility, we might see that changing. The biggest change of all, of course, will be if oil were ever to be counted in euros rather than dollars. I must say I think that is a long way away, if it will ever happen. I have heard a Nobel Prize winning economist urging that the euro, the dollar and the yen should merge as a single world currency. I have my doubts about this, but I don't argue with Nobel Prize winning economists. Where the EU has not really succeeded yet is as a security actor. As I said earlier, NATO remains the bedrock for this. And European member states' attitudes to NATO vary along a spectrum from the French on the one hand, who want to see a purely European solution for European problems and try and keep the United States out of this as much as possible, to the British, on the other hand, who are committed to transatlanticism under any conceivable British administration, be it Liberal, Labour or Conservative, and who will basically prevent the French from ever setting up an independent European security capacity, and have successfully done so on a number of occasions. It's interesting that insofar as there has been progress in EU security issues, it's been where the French and British have managed to agree. And examples of that have been the first EU military deployment, which was in Macedonia last year. Okay, this wasn't a very glorious affair. This was 150 soldiers on the ground with 450 backing them up in headquarters. This is peacekeeping very light indeed. But they're hoping to deploy a much bigger mission into Bosnia at the end of this year. Similarly, the EU is now trying to do small peacekeeping stuff, police reform, currently in Macedonia and in Bosnia. Currently looking also at reforming the rule of law in Georgia. But these are missions that have previously been carried out by the OSCE, and I think have previously been carried out more successfully by the OSCE, not just because the OSCE was able to draw on American, Canadian policemen and lawyers, although I think I've noticed them being quite prominent in such missions, but I think also that the OSCE has tended to have a more decentralized approach to these issues, whereas the EU is still trying to prove that everything can be done from and through Brussels. However, perhaps that's less important than the bigger picture. The bigger picture is that the European Union is now a bloc of 25, possibly, if you take all the ones in my list earlier, up to over 30 nations, which is going to be of huge gravitational attraction to its immediate neighbourhood. And the biggest of the neighbours that people kind of get most obsessed about is Russia. But Russia, I think, will make its own decision one way or the other. I'm much more concerned myself about North Africa. It seems to me that there you've got 5 or 6 countries between Morocco and Egypt, all of which are full of young, unemployed men, which is one of your classic potential conflict indicators, all of whom are looking with envy across the Mediterranean to the European Union, some of whom are literally dying to get there. And if you look at what's happening on the Morocco-Spanish Strait, it's really very worrying indeed. It seems to me that the European Union hasn't developed a sufficiently convincing vision for its own neighbourhood. I would like to see a greater Euro-Mediterranean space, a space that would offer some kind of political and economic and humanitarian liberty, a common future for people living between Casablanca and Vladivostok. It seems to me that that's what the European... for the United States, it was easy. Once you'd got California, it was fairly clear what your manifest destiny was going to be. It was to fill up the spaces in between, with a couple of other fringy bits. Sorry if there's anyone from Alaska or Hawaii here. But to me, if the EU is looking for a manifest destiny, that's what it's got to be, to fill up that space between Casablanca and Vladivostok, and to fill it with a shared civilizational value. And that's where perhaps Giscard's famous phrases, wonderful phrases about being united in diversity, responsibilities towards future generations and the earth, maybe that can be turned into something a little bit more weighty than the sort of paper airplane that I fear it is at the moment. Anyway, thank you very much. I look forward to answering your questions. We seem to have a travelling microphone.
All right. Stan, go ahead.
I have a question about two countries, Switzerland and Ukraine. With Switzerland, have they done any form of integration with NATO or anything else? And with Ukraine, are they looking to go more with the European Union in some future date, or are they more likely to follow Russia?
Yeah. Well, on Ukraine, we can't answer any questions before October 31st, which is the date of the next presidential election, and that, I think, will determine which direction Ukraine chooses to go in. The consequences, if Ukraine decides seriously to pursue a European path rather than a Russian satellite path, and I wouldn't be surprised from either of the two main presidential candidates if they were to do that, that's going to face the European Union with serious difficulties conceptually, because while you can debate the question of whether Turkey is really European, and that has now been decided in the positive, in the affirmative, there's no debate about whether Ukraine is in Europe. From looking at the map, it is. At the same time, it's a very long way from the Copenhagen criteria, which are the determination of whether or not you can be a member of the EU. That is, whether you have a functioning democracy, Ukraine very, very dubious on that, and whether you have a functioning market economy, even more dubious in the case of Ukraine. However, if Ukraine decides unilaterally to work on those questions, the EU is going to find it very difficult to turn them down. Switzerland's a different question. I mean, Switzerland was part of EFTA, the European Free Trade Association, which was set up by the British in 1958, basically the countries that didn't want to join the EU at that stage. Over the years since then, all of the EFTA members have now joined the EU, with the exception of Switzerland, Norway, as I mentioned twice, Iceland, which is worried about its fish stocks being taken over by the Europeans, and is quite right in that, because they would be, and Liechtenstein, which I know nobody loses much sleep about. Liechtenstein will never join the EU, because as long as they can keep up banking for criminals, this is not something they want to lose. Switzerland, a slightly different situation, has signed up basically to all of the EU commercial legislation in order to continue trading with EU member states. And this is very weird because they're effectively being given legislation without having any voice in drawing it up. But they have voluntarily chosen to do that. I think Switzerland will change in the next 20 years. I think they will join the EU. I don't think they will ever join NATO. Switzerland's defence tradition is quite peculiar by European standards. It's quite similar to the American defence tradition. And there is no chance of Switzerland joining up with anybody else in a military sense.
You mentioned that the EU is not a collective security institution.
Mm-hmm.
However, you did talk about a small military intervention in Macedonia. How was that action mustered if it's not a collective security institution? And also, why wasn't there some sort of extra EU coalition made if it was that important?
First of all, the experience of extra EU coalitions hasn't been a particularly happy one. It was done a couple of times in the 1990s, both times in Albania, oddly enough, coalitions of the willing led by the Italians, which works perfectly well in Albania, which after all has been invaded by Italy several times before anyway. But it's a different question. Now, collective security is a different issue from peacekeeping. And the Macedonian peacekeeping mission was one that the Macedonian government had asked for rather than one that was being imposed on them. Okay, their arms were kind of behind their backs when they asked for it, but nonetheless they did ask for it. And it's much easier to sell that to countries with a tradition of neutrality and countries that are wary about intervention abroad. The odd thing is that the one EU member state where there was serious political difficulties about a military presence in Macedonia, intervention, again, is slightly the wrong word because the situation had already calmed down. But the one country where there was a serious internal problem about selling it to the parliament was Germany, partly because there was a concern that, well, I mean, it really tied into the domestic German politics and the thin majority of Chancellor Schroeder in the Bundestag, and it was used as an opportunity to try and peel away the more pacifist members of his party. It didn't work. So the EU's commitment to soft peacekeeping tasks that will be deployment of a small number of peacekeepers is clear, but that doesn't mean war making. It doesn't even extend to imposing peace. Peacekeeping, yes. Peace imposition, no.
You talked about North Africa and tried to stabilize North Africa, and I know they've tried with their, not really tried, but they have the Barcelona process. Now, when you go from from the Coreper and the Parliament, are you asking for more money for that process? Because I don't think there was a lot of will behind it, or is that a good process? Or?
Good question. I'm asking for more process behind that process.
Okay, it's just paperwork.
I find it totally unconvincing, the Barcelona process. It's been based entirely on the idea that the Israel-Palestine process would move forward and that somehow this will pull in the other Arab countries behind them. I think that simplifies down the North African countries. What does Morocco really care about what's going on? I mean, in the newspapers they do, but in terms of domestic policy, it's pretty irrelevant, I would have thought. I think the EU needs to be looking much more seriously at this. Now, they're replacing the Barcelona process with a thing called the European Neighbourhood Policy, which is supposed to take in Moldova, Ukraine, 3 South Caucasus countries, and then the Barcelona process countries. But it still seems a bit fuzzy. It's not clear, for instance, if it includes Iraq or Iran. I'm not very satisfied with it. Well, they should do both. I mean, actually, I'm a maverick hardliner on immigration. I think that the barriers should be lowered. It seems to me that no one's going to pay my pension in 30 years' time when I retire, unless I can get another job. But unless I've got lots more people in Europe working for me, and the birth rate is rather low. I've got 3 children. I'm doing my best, but my neighbours aren't.
I have a 2-part question. Actually, you mentioned the states from Casablanca to Vladivostok. There are the 3 states there, like the Maghreb states. Does, in your view, does the EU, particularly France and Great Britain, feel somewhat of a responsibility to provide for them or extend some sort of work to them because they are primarily the reasons why there's such a large stemming from colonization, and the other part is the Turkey. What exactly is the barrier keeping Turkey out at this point, after the many concessions it's made?
Right. Yes, the Maghreb countries are basically seen as a French playground, and Morocco to the Spanish to a certain extent, Tunisia to the Italians to a certain extent, but France is the key player, and that's something that I think should be changed. And I think it's a Europe-wide concern what is happening in that region. Turkey, the real most problematic barrier in Turkey is the prospect of a military takeover. There's no way that any state will be allowed to join the European Union when there's a possibility that the military might mount a coup against democratically elected leadership. The other issues, I mean, there are problems with the economy, there are problems with human rights. These are things that can and are being dealt with in the process of reforms. It will be a long process. It's a big country. It's a big bite for the EU to take in. I mean, the population of Turkey is, where are we, 71 million. That's bigger than any other EU member state except Germany. And projected to, by 2015, when Turkey may join, it may well have the same population as Germany if it goes on expanding at its current rate. I got the figures here for annual expansion of, where are we? Yes, Turkey natural increase per thousand is 22 per thousand, so 2.2% annual growth of population, which is huge. Germany, however, is shrinking by 1.1% annually. So, there's another part of the story. At the same time, I think Turkey is its own best friend. Turkish diplomats and officials turning up in the EU give a very good account of themselves, and I think that over the 10-year process of integration, people will realise that there's not very much to worry about, provided the military question can be sorted.
You don't believe the Muslim issue is one at all? It was for France for some time.
It is still an issue for France, and it is still an issue for the German opposition. But if you look at the way the French Muslim community has been playing the political game internally in France, they've been doing awfully well in recent weeks and months. In particular, if you recall, there were some French hostages kidnapped in Iraq, threatened with execution unless France reversed its ban on the wearing of the Islamic headscarf in schools. And French Muslims demonstrated against the hostage taking, even though, of course, they also opposed the headscarf ban. But they said this, saying quite clearly to the Iraqis, this is not a price that we want to pay to win this particular battle. Similarly with Germany, I mean, you see these alliances. There's a shameless opportunism from the German opposition at the moment. I think you put them in power and they may sing a different tune.
With the freedom of movement now, I imagine that from many of the most recent countries, the ones that you had the right column, the far right column,
Mm-hmm.
I imagine that many of those people in those countries will be moving to the more developed nations to work, for education. Mm-hmm. What problems does that pose to the country where there is flight from, and also for the countries where they're moving into?
Yeah. I mean, I come from Ireland, which has had a history of emigration for most of the last 160 years. The population of Ireland in 1840 was 8 million. It's now 6 million. And and when I was born, it was 5 million. Ireland has changed colossally in the last 10 years as a result of European integration. When it joined, it was the poorest member state of the EU on per capita income basis. Now, as you know, it's moving. It's certainly in the top third of the table and moving rapidly towards the very top. And I think this shows that people move when they think they will lose something by staying. If you can create a single market so that you can trade from Estonia as easily as you can trade from France, people are less likely to leave Estonia, or indeed they're more likely to go back and bring back the expertise that they have learned abroad. So it seems to me that and this has been very much a lesson in Portugal as well, another success story from the EU. The other thing is that emigration has tended to actually be rather lower than expected, at least in terms of huge numbers of people moving to the major Western European capitals. The one exception there is where you've got a sharp differential of income across borders. So you are getting a certain amount of settlement of migrants in Eastern Germany and Eastern Austria. And that is leading to local political problems, as we've seen in recent elections in both of those countries. And there, I think there is a case for extra transitional aid to those regions of the richer European countries to help them absorb the shock. But this is actually quite a small area we're talking about. On the whole, people prefer to stay there. I should also say that the freedom of movement policy has been implemented in a rather mean-spirited way, with kind of 7-year transition periods for most of the EU member states. It doesn't matter. I mean, they'll come or not as they choose anyway. And also, I refer back to my previous remarks about who's going to pay my pension.
Thank you. You referred to the economic strength of the EU, and also that the Balkan states will be soon to be added.
Mm-hmm.
Given the history of the Balkan nations and the violence there, is that going to negatively affect the economic strength of the European Union?
Only if they start fighting with each other again. And but I mean, look at the history of this. 50 years ago, I don't know what the local attitude is to gambling. My wife, who's a firm Methodist, is very against it. But in 1954, I'm an Irish Catholic. In 1954. If someone had asked you to take odds on another war between France and Germany in the next 50 years, given that in 1954 there had been 3 vicious wars between France and Germany in the previous 100 years, it would have seemed like a reasonable proposition. Now it's unthinkable, isn't it? I mean, there is no chance whatsoever of war between France and Germany. And the hope would be that by integrating and sharing resources through the European Union, that the Balkan states will manage to transcend those conflicts. As we have seen with, we hear a lot about the wars of the former Yugoslavia. Let's not forget the dogs that didn't bark in this fight. Let's not forget that there has been no serious conflict between Hungary and Slovakia with its big Hungarian minority, or indeed with Romania. I mean, you've had odd bits of irresponsible sabre rattling from Hungarian elections, from Hungarian governments at election time, or recently when they were changing prime minister. But it's not been a serious risk to peace and stability. My own home territory of Northern Ireland, the European dimension, I think, helped indirectly in the resolution of the conflict. It took quite a long time. We've been in the EU from 1974, didn't get a peace agreement until 24 years later. I hope the Balkans don't have to wait quite so long.
With Moldova, from what I understand...
Yes, somebody asked about Moldova. Thank you.
Well, it's close to my heart, too. So, Moldova, what is going on there? Because I know this summer there were some political changes, from what I understand, possibly voting in communist leaders. Maybe I'm wrong with that, but is that going to keep it from the EU, or what's going on there? Or?
Yeah, I mean, the Moldovan communists have been in power for 3 years now, having lost... Obviously, they lost power after the fall of communism. The fall of communism means communists lost power. But they won the elections in 2001 with a reasonably strong mandate. They won them quite fairly, it must be said, because the anti-communist opposition was pathetic, corrupt and incompetent in government, and they deserved to lose the elections, and they're still bumping along the bottom of the opinion polls in the same way as, Democrats in Utah, I suppose. So the communists are pretty firmly in power in Moldova. The interesting thing is who's in power in the separatist province, which is occupied by the Soviet army, which never evacuated after the fall of the Soviet Union, which is a bit embarrassing to have the Soviet army still there 13 years after the country ceased to exist. So the question is whether there will be some kind of reintegration. Over the last summer, there's been a distinct rise in tension with attacks by the separatist leadership on schools, trying to take control of railway stations. I see the situation there as a bit more volatile than one would like. It's fueled really by Russian policy. And when I say Russian policy, I mean Russian Ministry of Defense policy. It's interesting, Russian diplomats are completely dispirited and annoyed with the President and with the Ministry of Defense for screwing up what would be an otherwise perfectly soluble problem. In the meantime, the EU has shown very little interest in getting engaged, and it's one of the things I'm trying to do in Brussels to try and push them to take an interest. I think if they were to do so and give the Moldovans a serious European prospect, that might encourage better behaviour all round, including from the communists. And let's not forget that the current government in Hungary is an ex-communist government. The current government in various other countries, have flip-flopped back and forth. I think the Poles too are in that category. So just because they're former communists doesn't necessarily mean that they are sworn up, sworn devil worshippers or whatever.
I wanted to ask about the drug trade and the human trafficking.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like you mentioned with Moldova, that's, in that area, Moldova, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, that's a main corridor for, drug and human trafficking. And so,
Mm-hmm.
and then, so I wanted to ask, how is the European Union addressing that? That's your office, crisis management. So how are you addressing that in those countries? And also, how are they planning to deal with it if Turkey and Bulgaria exceed and enter the union, and the border safeguards are dissolved? How are they going to deal with that?
You'll be interested to know that Turkey and Bulgaria have actually got relatively good records on this, and they're, the shipment has kind of these days tends to bypass those two countries. And if you look at the map, you can see how difficult it is to police the entire of the Mediterranean Sea. When you've got shipments these days mainly coming in from Lebanon, where it's much more difficult to enforce the rule of law, particularly the rule of other people's law. It's a big domestic issue in Europe, both people trafficking and drug smuggling. It's not something that my group addresses. We tend to look more at the big picture conflicts, and there are other organisations, like particularly the International Organization of Migration, which works very hard on this issue. So it's something that we're tracking. I think that the people trafficking issue is made worse and not better by the stringent visa requirements on people coming from third countries. It seems to me that having stringent visa requirements penalises honest travellers and rewards those who traffic in human beings. This is not an argument that I have won yet, as you will observe.
One more question. It's 5 o'clock, and I think some of you may have other things, please.
What proposals do you have for the conflicts in Georgia? What kind of solutions do you foresee?
Right. Well, which one of the 3 or 4 are we on to? But Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Abkhazia we're only really starting to get into. It's very difficult to see Abkhazia going back into full Georgian rule. South Ossetia, you could see that. With South Ossetia, you've got the weird situation of a separatist government ruling people who actually aren't all that separatist. And if they were approached in the right way, they could be persuaded to rejoin the Georgian state. So far this year, they've been approached in the wrong way. I mean, shooting at people is not a way to convince them that you're right, at least not in Georgia. At least not in that Georgia. I mean, I don't know about your Georgia. So we're actually preparing a report on this, which will be published, I hope, later this month, in which we'll be telling the Georgians not to be so stupid next time they try and resolve it, but also telling the Russians that Russian policy is driving this to a certain extent. And when you have granted Russian citizenship to the entire population of South Ossetia, when people can vote in Russian presidential elections in South Ossetia, there's posters up all over the place for Mr. Putin, if you go there. This makes Russia's supposed commitment to Georgia's territorial integrity look a little bit threadbare. So I think a consistent policy from Russia, preferably one where they feel they're getting rewarded in terms of EU and American help. And the big issue, the big geostrategic issue here is that in South Ossetia, the main road from Russia to Iran goes through that region. And currently it's basically blocked by the conflict. If it were unblocked, you would see a massive increase in trade between some of the poorest regions of Russia and some of the most interestingly developing parts of the Muslim world. And that surely is a prize that is worth a certain amount of compromise on behalf of the South Ossetians. Well, depending on what their leadership tells them, which will depend on what they're told to say by Moscow. So I think that will be quite a difficult one to crack. But at the same time, there is sufficient interest even in Washington in trying to get the Russians to see light on this. I know that there are other more important issues, both for Washington and for the EU, in which they want to be friends with the Russians, but it's interesting that South Ossetia has never quite fallen off the end. Likewise Abkhazia, likewise Moldova. So chances of further conflict there, quite high. Chances of resolution, I think also not that low. Abkhazia I'm much more depressed about.